All right, after the Germany coalition collapse, what does this all mean for Ukraine? Well, for some analysis, let's get both perspectives from Berlin with DW's head of news, Max Hoffman, and with DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv. To both of you gentlemen, welcome. It's good to have you with us tonight. Nick, let me start with you. In the eyes of Ukrainians, what is worse, Donald Trump back in the White House or the current German government collapsing?
Look, Brent, I don't think anyone in Kyiv is going to be shedding a tear if Olaf Scholz loses his job, even though Germany is the second biggest donor to Ukraine after the US in terms of military and financial support. That's seen here as something that's happened despite Olaf Scholz's best efforts rather than thanks to him. That's just the perception here, accurate or not. I think the real worry is that Germany could just be consumed with kind of introspection for the next 5 months or so if an election is really only held in March, as has been discussed. But compared to what's happened in Washington, it's obviously not as big a deal. This is the main question right now in Kiev. What will Trump do? Will he try to kind of stick to his campaign pledges about ending the war in 24 hours, as he said? I mean, the 1000th day of this war is pretty close. And for most people, those claims seemed a lot like code for basically just pulling the plug on support for Ukraine and forcing Volodymyr Zelensky to basically go cap in hand to Vladimir Putin. So that is the main focus of attention now. But certainly Germany being occupied with its own business is not good for Ukraine either.
Max, let me bring it to you and look through the Berlin government lens. I mean, we know that Donald Trump does not support any more aid for Ukraine. That would mean that Germany would be Ukraine's #1 donor by default if the aid were to stop coming from Washington. More money, more weapons for Ukraine at the expense of Germany. I mean, you can't win an early election with that, can you?
Well, there's widespread agreement here, Brent, that no country can pick up the slack from the U.S., especially when it comes to delivery of heavy weaponry and ammunition to Ukraine. Money's a different issue. Germany theoretically would be able to spend more money to support Ukraine, but it would need to have a government with a majority in parliament, and they don't have that at the moment. That much is clear. Now, would it be a killer at the voting booth to pledge more support, more financial support, more delivery of weapons and ammunition? It's hard to say. If we look at the polls, yes, they are evolving into one direction. They're evolving into the direction that support for this delivery, for spending so much money on Ukraine, is eroding in Germany. So it's declining. There are some polls that show that there's still a significant part of the population in Germany, though, that do support this or even want more support for Ukraine. So in the end, it really depends which part of the voting population you're trying to target with that. And if you do want to target those that support Ukraine, they still make up a significant part of the population.
I want to ask you, Max, too, about what Mr. Stegner just mentioned and this fear of the rise of the far right in politics here. I mean, we saw it played out somewhat with Donald Trump. And there's fears that it could happen here, for example, with the AfD party. And we know that the AfD is against aid for Ukraine. So wouldn't any increase in German responsibility for Ukraine, wouldn't it strengthen the AfD's chances on election day next year?
It might play a role, although the far-right AfD now has competition when it comes to this policy point with the newly established BSW party, which is in the context of Germany fairly Russia-friendly, and they also attract people who are against supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia. So that part of the vote might be split, might not help the AfD as much as you would think. But still, polls again here, AfD is doing very well in the polls, although all those numbers have been established before this happened yesterday, before this current coalition crashed. They're at about 18%, and the Ukraine question is definitely a part of that success, but not the only part of that success.
Nick, let me ask you before we run out of time here. Ukraine's military has to get through yet another winter. If German elections are held in March or even sooner, what would the ideal outcome be in the eyes of Ukrainian President Zelensky?
I think it's clear that it's not another Scholz government. That is evident from all the kind of statements you have heard for the last 2 years. They've found a way of dealing with him, but he's definitely not their first choice. Other parties in his coalition, the Greens and also the Liberals, are seen with a lot more open, more sympathetic to Ukraine here, especially the Greens. Annalena Baerbock, Germany's foreign minister, here just a couple of days ago for what looks like probably her last visit here in Ukraine. I think looking at the Conservatives, at the Christian Democrats, there is a lot more there in terms of talk of giving Ukraine more of what it wants in terms of long-distance weapons. We've had their leader, Merz, there talking about an ultimatum to the Russian side, saying, if you do not stop attacking Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, if you don't stop attacking power stations, then we will give those Taurus, those missiles that Germany has been refusing so far to hand over, and that Ukraine says it needs to basically increase the price of this war for Russia and force Russia to come to the negotiating table on terms that Ukrainians can live with. So that is something that's seen with a lot of optimism here. Obviously, AfD and also criticism of help for Ukraine from the left, from Sarah Wagenknecht, is something that they are painfully aware of. But for now, it seems like this German kind of political crisis could end up coming up with a government that is more open to the kinds of things that Ukraine needs.
Yeah, unexpected intentions there. DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv and DW's head of news, Max Hoffman, here in Berlin. To both of you, thank you. Well, for more now, I'm joined by Ralph Stegner. He's a member of the German parliament for the Social Democrats. That is the party of Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Mr. Stegner, it's good to have you with us tonight. Let me ask you, why wait until next January to have a confidence vote in Parliament? You know, as the saying goes, the longer one waits, the bigger the toll it takes.
Well, good evening. The situation is different. We have really put much effort in getting an agreement with our coalition partners until yesterday in the evening, when the finance minister decided to walk away from his responsibility. But the chancellor has responsibility, and we're in a situation where after the American elections, the president-elect is not yet here, but there are important international tasks to be solved. For instance, the next war winter in the Ukraine will come, and it doesn't make any sense that the biggest economic power in Europe would be in election campaign times as long as the Americans haven't had their change of government yet. We don't talk about postponing the possibility to vote. We do that pretty soon, but I think it's reasonable to make this question of confidence in the January session and then have elections in March. That's pretty soon.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's the decision of the Chancellor anyway, as our Constitution rules it.
Yeah, I mean, it's his decision, and then, of course, it's up to lawmakers in Parliament to decide whether or not they have confidence in him. Would you agree that the Chancellor has little chance of surviving the vote of confidence?
Well, the point is different. I mean, the Conservatives, just a couple of days ago, they suggested that they would work together with a minority government in important questions for the country. And now I think we should take them by their word. The Conservative opposition could also use their responsibility and work together with the government. And then we come to election pretty soon. Having elections not in October as it was the regular time, but having them in early March, I think is not too late. But besides, as I said, there are important things to be put on the track.
Mr. Stegner, why would the opposition parties, why would they want to cooperate with a minority government? It's in their interest for early elections to take place as soon as possible.
Well, only if you see it as a very partisan, only as a partisan point, but there are things like responsibility for the country. And we're in an economic crisis. We have the war in Ukraine, we have a war in the Near East, and there are important things to be done. And we only have the situation because the Liberal Minister of Finance walked away from his responsibility. And I think it's not about party politics now, but it's about responsibility for the country in difficult times. And Therefore, our Chancellor explained things on TV yesterday in a speech, and we got a lot of positive response. People understand why it's important to getting some things done and then quickly come to elections. We will have them, but I think opposition should take responsibility as well.
If we do come to early elections in March, the Chancellor will campaign on a platform of not being able to hold a coalition government together for an entire term. That doesn't sound like a winning recipe for re-election.
I don't think so. Actually, we would campaign on an agenda that tries in very difficult times with war in Europe, war in the Near East, in an energy crisis and other things, trying to keep the country together, not having a divided country as we've seen that in the American campaign. Helping, for instance, the Ukrainian people, and at the same time keeping our society together. Not that the populist parties and the right-wing parties win because we have a divided society. And it's an election campaign over responsibility. And see, as you can see in some of our other states, in Saxony, for instance, the Christian Democratic leader there has had talks with the right-wing extremists, and there you can see where the responsibility is in the Conservative Party. I'm not worried that the people wouldn't see that the Chancellor does a good job.
Mr. Stater, let me just ask you before we run out of time, if you are giving time for the U.S. president to get into office, you know that Donald Trump has said that he wants to end all aid to Ukraine. Maybe by March, he will have ended the war. That's a best case scenario. If that is the case, would that allow your party and your chancellor to campaign on the peace dividend?
But first of all, we're talking about peace is what we all want to have. And on the other hand, Mr. Trump says a lot of things if the day is long enough. I don't believe any of that he would be able to end the war within one day, as he said. That's typically Trump rhetoric. We try to make policies here on real terms and not on this kind of rhetoric that doesn't he can't keep his promises. Everybody knows that.
Okay, German Social Democrat lawmaker Mr. Ralph Stegner. Mr. Stegner, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us during what is a very, very busy week. Thank you.
Thank you.